Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on History Fight Podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor James Barker. And today we're going to be discussing his upcoming book titled Writing and Rewriting the Gospels, John and the Synoptics. So thank you for joining me today, James.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to be with you again.
It's good to have you back. And just to inform everybody that the link to pre-order the book is in the description below, but it will also be in the pinned comment after the live stream concludes. So, James, can you tell us a little bit about what your upcoming book is about? Obviously, it's about all four Gospels, but can you tell us more?
Sure. It's about all four Gospels, and it's about how they're all interrelated. But the title of Writing and Rewriting starts with how do you even write a book in antiquity? And so I spend a chapter talking about ancient writing materials and practices, and a lot of things that scholars, I think, either take for granted, don't fully understand, or discuss and misrepresent. So I tried to correct a lot of those misperceptions, just to say this is how we would get a book in antiquity in the first place. To write a gospel, I am firmly committed to Markan priority. I think that's one of the triumphs of 19th century scholarship, that Mark was the first gospel written. But what I argue is different than what most people would say from there. I think Matthew used Mark, which is the consensus. I think Luke used Mark. That's the consensus. I think Luke used Matthew, and that's where the consensus is divided. But then I think that John used all three of the synoptics. So there is what I call repeatedly throughout the book a simple snowballing trajectory from Mark to Matthew to Luke to John. Each one has read the other and has closely studied the other and is rewriting certain stories. So you write a gospel and then you rewrite a gospel. And that's the simple question of why do we have three synoptic gospels that are so similar and yet so different? Then why do we have John that is so different still? Well, because rewriting was a well-documented phenomenon in antiquity, to take something that you liked and then to rewrite it in your own original way. And I really do think that the origins of our canonical gospels are just that simple.
Can you tell us a little bit about the trajectory you see the Gospels being written down from the order of Mark, Matthew to Luke to John? What do you see in Luke that provides clues that Luke knew Matthew? And what do you see in John that provides clues that he knows all three of the synoptic Gospels?
Well, for the Mark to Matthew to Luke trajectory, that's what's known as the Ferrer hypothesis to solve the synoptic problem. And I think the simplest way to imagine it is an accordion. And you start with Mark, the most compressed gospel. We have no idea how old Jesus is. We just know that he's an adult who shows up to be baptized by John the Baptist. And that's the beginning of the gospel. And then we're told what a great teacher he is, but we don't get a whole lot of that teaching except a long run of parables that nobody seems to understand. And then if you go to the end of the Gospel of Mark, we are told that he rose from the dead, but we don't actually encounter the risen Jesus. So if what Matthew does is just expand that accordion from the beginning to the middle to the end. So we start with a birth narrative, and you get an idea of where Jesus came from. And you get many more teachings of Jesus. At the exact moment that Mark says, Jesus was such a great teacher, and they marveled at his teaching, and you're questioning, what teaching? Matthew gives you the Sermon on the Mount. That's what teaching, Mark. And then when you get to the end of the gospel, well, Matthew has Jesus say the very words that the young man had said to the women at the tomb in the Gospel of Mark. So Jesus actually then shows up and does, as promised in Mark's gospel, meet the disciples in Galilee. But he ends and he says, and I'm going to be with you forever, which raises a question of his whereabouts. And so Luke expands that accordion even further and says, well, where did John the Baptist come from? Let me give you a birth narrative for John the Baptist. And did you know, by the way, that he was related to Jesus? No, I didn't know that. I had only read Matthew and Mark, neither of which told me that they were relatives. Luke adds that to the beginning. Luke adds additional teachings through the middle part of the gospel. And then when you get to the end, he cleans up something that you see from Matthew. I'll be with you forever. Luke says, I'll be with you forever in spirit. Because at the end of the Gospel of Luke, Jesus gets into a cloud and he rides up into the heavens to be with God. And then if you read the sequel to Luke, the book of Acts, the apostles are saying, oh, it's necessary. He had to go away and he's going to stay away and he won't come again until final judgment. And so if you see that macro level snowball, we get much more biographical information and background information. Luke will even tell you Jesus was about 30 years old. That's very specific. Something you can put together if you've read Matthew and you happen to know that Jesus was born during the time of Herod the Great and he died during the reign of Pontius Pilate. He has to be less than 40 years old. But if you just read Mark, you don't know when Jesus was born because there's nothing about Herod the Great, right? So that Mark to Matthew to Luke, simple accordion, expansion, compression. I think that it explains best how they know certain things that are lacking. Mark, to his credit, he writes you the first gospel. And if you just had Paul's letters, well, you don't know any of this stuff that Mark told you about Jesus. And I just imagine Mark saying, I wrote you a gospel. You're welcome. Paul will tell you that there was an empty tomb, but we have, he doesn't tell you anything about an empty tomb. He just tells you that Jesus was raised in some sort of imperishable body. Mark gives you a story of an empty tomb, that his physical body had disappeared. And Mark doesn't see the problem of that being the end of the gospel. Matthew thinks it's a little bit of a problem because he'd feel more comfortable if readers actually got to get a glimpse of the risen Jesus. And so he would say, you're welcome. I wrote you a resurrection account. Luke would read that and say, yeah, but you ended with the idea that Jesus is still just out there somewhere. He's going to be with us forever. And he clearly isn't. So you're welcome. I wrote you the ascension story. So from Mark to Matthew to Luke, I think it is relatively simple. I think a lot of previous scholarship overcomplicates the synoptic problem, mostly by invoking hypothetical source texts that are just hypotheses built upon hypotheses. John's use of the synoptics is admittedly quite different. John is not using Matthew, Mark, and Luke in the same way, say, that Matthew used Mark, that Luke used Mark, or that I would even say that Luke used Matthew and Mark, mostly because he's using far less material from them. He's not giving you the same basic rundown. He's adding a lot of original content. But when he does tell you something that you see from the Synoptic Gospels, say the feeding of the 5,000, he shows very clearly that he knows specific details from each gospel, not just a story that Jesus miraculously fed 5,000 people. But Mark says 5,000 men. Matthew adds 5,000 men, not counting the women and the children. Well, John has a little boy provide the food, who is definitely not a man, just from Mark's account. He's a child, as Matthew told you that was there. You also see things in John where, sticking with the feeding of the 5,000, the disciples will say, seemingly in unison, we don't have enough food for all these people. And I think that sounds a little weird to John, that except in musicals, people don't tend to speak in unison. So John will divide up individual speaking parts. Jesus will say to Philip, how are we going to feed all of these people? And Philip will reply, yeah, we don't, all these denarii wouldn't be enough to feed all these people. And then Philip's brother Andrew says, well, there's this kid who's got this bread and fish. I don't know if that'll be enough. So John will create this, what Mark Goodacre calls dramatizations, that John adds elements of drama, and he gives characters individual speaking parts. Thomas never says a word in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He gets speaking parts in John's gospel. The priests will say things in unison in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Caiaphas becomes a character with speaking parts, like you would do if you were casting a film and you just had the camera on one individual. So even when John is telling you a story that's adjacent to the Synoptics, John seems to know what the Synoptics have done, and John definitely knows what he's doing. And a lot of what he's doing is cleaning things up and drawing tidbits from here and there that I think shows that he has studied multiple gospels very, very carefully.
I want to go back to what you said about the issue of hypothetical sources. Do you think that there were any lost pre-Markan sources, or do you think Mark just had Paul in front of him and that was it? There's no evidence that Mark knew anything of any kind besides Paul.
I think Paul is our main source, and I actually, in the course of writing this book, I became increasingly convinced that all four of the canonical evangelists are reading Paul. The question is how much of Paul, and potentially Deutero-Pauline letters as well. I definitely think Paul is the main focus. There has long been hypothesized a pre-Markan passion narrative, and Cliff Black has written extensively on how you just can't really make it work. You can't find enough evidence for it. There are places, if you read Adela Collins's commentary on Mark, she will show places where it really does look like Mark is redacting a source, particularly in the passion narrative. And those are very good points and very good examples of exegesis. They can also be explained as Mark revising Mark's own writing. So what looks to be Markan redaction may just be Mark having gone through multiple drafts, which is why I go back to the beginning and talk so much about how did you write a book in the first place. I think the one thing, if you wanted to claim a pre-Markan passion narrative, the one thing that hypothesis has in its favor is that it doesn't seem that Mark is catching some of these Old Testament allusions, particularly Psalm 22 with the crucifixion narrative. My God, why have you forsaken me? The whole psalm is the crucifixion narrative, and there are a lot of echoes and allusions. We Richard Hayes would say, may he rest in peace, of Paul that we see when we read Mark. And Mark doesn't always seem to, either he presupposes them or they're just lost on him. So that's where you might say that he inherited something. But in general, if I don't have it as a text I can read, I don't try to reconstruct it, because the reconstruction's coming from my imagination. And then if I'm going to build my argument on something I made up, I just don't think it's the best scholarly practice. And I think that we can at least explain the four that we have in the canon. We can explain them just as I said. We don't need to appeal to anything else. Were there other things that Mark used? Maybe. Could we prove it? Absolutely not. So should we spend a career trying to reconstruct it? I don't think so. I've gone a different path, but I'll leave it to others who want to pursue and reconstruct hypothetical sources.
So in terms of rewriting, when you see the longer ending of Mark, it does have parallels to Luke's resurrection narrative. What do you think the relationship is there?
It's a great example. The longer ending of Mark is actually pieces of Matthew, Luke, and even John, and potentially Acts. And you can just draw up a synopsis and you can see where whoever wrote the longer ending of Mark knows all of the resurrection appearances that we know from Matthew, Luke, and John, and probably is even pointing to things like the snakes won't harm you, which we famously have with Paul in the book of Acts. And it's not an accident that we have the longer ending of Mark show up in the so-called Western order of the Gospels: Matthew, John, Luke, Mark, with the longer ending, then transitioning to Acts. So it's a wonderful example of rewriting, because it's not word for word from any one. It's not like the longer ending of Mark is just the Great Commission from Matthew, right? But it knows the Great Commission from Matthew. So it's more an example of harmonizing. It's more the kind of thing that Tatian did when he wrote the Diatessaron, this long lost but famous harmony of the Gospels that I've also written a book on, which really got me thinking about how the rewriting process. That's a great harmonization of existing sources.
We have a super chat question from Michael E. Thank you for your super chat. Where would the Gospel of Thomas fit in your snowball?
Oh, great question. And just read Mark Goodacre's book on a Gospel of Thomas and how Thomas is dependent on Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Thomas, as we have it, shows signs of not just things that Matthew said that echo something remote that Matthew said here and there. What Thomas does is show specific ways that Matthew has redacted Mark's gospel. Thomas doesn't just know little quasi-Lucan material here and there. Thomas knows very specific ways that Luke has redacted Matthew. And that is our strictest test for determining literary dependence. So Thomas is dependent on Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but does not appear, at least the sayings Gospel of Thomas, does not appear to have any relation to the Gospel of John. But Mark Goodacre's book is as good a demonstration of that as you'll find. Particularly a chapter he calls the missing middle. It's a phenomenon throughout the Gospel of Thomas where Thomas will kind of give you the beginning and end of a well-known saying, and he presupposes the middle that's laid out in the Synoptics, but just jumps to the end, and it's a marvelous book. And Mark has his own book coming out arguing for the same hypothesis that I have, that the Farrer hypothesis solves the synoptic problem, but John does know all three synoptics. So I'll let Mark speak for himself on that. But for Thomas, it is a great example of that kind of snowball where you've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, Thomas, and Thomas is just more interested in the sayings and not the kind of discourses that we see in John.
So when you look at the Gospel of John, and as you know, it's been hypothesized that John was written in stages and compiled later, that maybe John 21 is a later insertion. Do you see evidence of rewriting in John, or would you call a lot of that hypothetical redactions, unprovable redactions?
For and often the multi-stage composition of the Gospel of John just so happens to end up being in 3 stages, and there have been numerous attempts at that from Rudolf Bultmann to Cam von Walde, and most famously Boismar's very complicated theory of all of these hypothetical documents that came together in all these hypothetical stages and ended up with John as we know it. And I dispense with that. And I actually have to qualify when I begin the book. I say I'm doing source criticism, and I'm doing source criticism of the Gospel of John. But oftentimes in New Testament scholarship, when we talk about the synoptic problem, source criticism means who's reading whose gospel. When we talk about source criticism as it relates to the Gospel of John, we mean this whole other universe of hypothetical sources. And I say that is not what I mean. When I do source criticism for John, I'm treating him like I do Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I ask who's using who, and I'm doing that type of analysis. I am not interested in hypothetical multi-stage compositions. I think that they are unprovable. You mentioned John 21. And that if you really wanted one place where it does look like something, you mentioned the longer ending of Mark. The parallel to that, of course, is the woman caught in the act of adultery. We know that that was not originally in the Gospel of John. So that's a later interpolation, and that goes without saying. John 21 is a more complicated phenomenon, and Mark Matson and I have talked a lot about this at multi-Catholic Biblical Association meetings. Mark thinks that Luke was reading John, not that John was reading Luke. So he and I disagree on that. But one thing we agree on, when we talk about John 21 as potentially being a later edition, we always just ask with a smile, like, well, how much later? A day later, a week later, a month later? Is it from the same author or from the same circle of authors? And even if it was a later edition, did it ever circulate without John 21? And there isn't really good evidence for that. The best, and I've never published on this, but the best evidence I've ever seen of that, if you wanted to make that argument, is if you read Irenaeus Against the Heresies, you can really pick up on so much of the Gospel of John that he has from chapters 1 through 20, what we know as chapters 1 through 20. And there's nothing about that miraculous catch of fish in John 21. So you could say, well, maybe he didn't have that because he might have alluded to it somewhere. Granted, it's an argument from silence, but it's also sort of a measurable absence. But the flip side to that is around the same time as Irenaeus, we have Tatian with the Diatessaron, and John 21 is already there in the Diatessaron. So you can't really argue that there ever was a John circulating without that last chapter. But definitely no on the hypothetical stages. And again, even if some of these scholars are right that John was written in these stages, like with Paul Anderson's work, isn't it funny how these three stages neatly align? Like once per decade, there was yet another stage written added to the Gospel of John. And I just keep thinking, how could we possibly know that? And a lot of that goes back to my training. AJ Levine was my dissertation advisor, and she said, with anything you ever write for me, you need to answer two questions. How do you know? And so what? So the so what is, of course, what is the significance of this? Why are you not just telling me something I could have found out for myself? Or how does this actually add to scholarship? But the how do you know question, that's where the bulk of your work is. And her point, just adamantly through years of grad school, was to say scholars think they know a lot more than they know. And if you start saying, what are your presuppositions? What are you basing this on? A lot of times the foundation crumbles. And she would say, if you want to write a dissertation for me, you need to start and build from the ground up. And I need it to have that solid foundation. So don't start with a thought experiment and see where you can run with it. Start with something more solid.
Efficientai, thank you for your super chat. Gospels are dated by the destruction of the temple, but previous prophets also predicted its destruction. What else attributes to the dating after 70?
That's a great question. I do think when I date the Gospels, I say very generally after the destruction of the temple in 70, and sometime before Ignatius, around the year 110, if we accept the traditional dating for Ignatius. And I've put this in print a couple of times now. I'm committed to it. That 40-year window, the point I want to press is that should be thought of as a narrow window. For most biblical scholars, that's a wide window. I just mentioned scholars who think that they can date things at these neat 10-year increments. Oh, we must allow time for this gospel or that gospel to have circulated. Look at a map of the Roman Empire. Go to Orbis, the Stanford model of the ancient world. You can get from anywhere to anywhere in the Roman Empire in less than a month. So we don't need decades for gospels to circulate for another one to have been composed. They could have been written in rapid succession. They could have been written after long increments. We have examples of literary proliferation that fit both those models. We shouldn't be tied to either one. I just say we have enough proof of Ignatius knowing Matthew, Luke, and John. And if you follow Mark in priority, that would entail that Mark had also been written, to say we have a collection of Gospels being read in Syria in the early 2nd century. Why start with 70? Well, other people did predict the destruction of the temple. How smart did you have to be to have predicted that the temple was going to be destroyed? Yeah, I have no problem at all saying the historical Jesus, although I'm not interested in historical Jesus research, and I make that point very early in the book as well. I have no problem saying that Jesus could have predicted the destruction of the temple. I also think that the Gospels are written after it had happened, and it is because of the specific way the apocalyptic discourse is framed, presupposes very specific details that had happened when Rome encircled Jerusalem. And Mark Goodacre, again, I appeal to him. I'm deeply indebted to him. He's become a great friend and a wonderful supporter of mine. And I wrote the foreword to my book. I just couldn't be more grateful for him. And when he talks about this, he says it very well. He as everything. He says, yes, Jesus could have made this prediction earlier, but the idea is that this would have happened and readers would have made the connection. That the Judean War actually would have spurred a considerable amount of interest in, well, what was going on? And that I hear that there was a revolt by those Jews in Judea. What exactly is going on there? Oh, here's a book about this guy there. So when you read the gospel, if you're not an insider, if you weren't like Josephus and you were part of the revolt itself, you would have an interest in it. And then when you would read these gospels, you would see, oh, okay, these things happened and they happened relatively recently. Even if that was, 1 year, 10 years, 40 years, that's still within a generation to say, oh, okay, this guy made this prediction. So again, could he have made the prediction in terms of the historical Jesus? For sure. But were the gospels written with knowledge of specific events that had transpired and the way the Romans had destroyed the temple? Yeah, I think so. I think there's plenty enough grounds to work from that basis to say, once it happened, and Mark seems to think once the temple has been destroyed, that the end of the world is going to come. And that's another nice snowball. Matthew says, well, Mark has this line in the apocalyptic discourse. Well, it's like when a slave owner goes away and he leaves his slave to charge, then he comes back and he wants to check up on him. Like, that's how the end will happen. Matthew comes to that point and he turns it into a parable. And he says, it's as though a slave owner went away for a long time. And that is the key phrase at that parable, that Matthew has already assumed that, yeah, the temple has been destroyed, but no, the end of the world didn't come. I guess we're going to be here a while. And so he turns it into a parable where the man stays gone for a long time and then final judgment happens. Luke famously, and Hans Conzelmann in Theology of the Gospel of Luke, one of these foundational works of redaction criticism, he said, Luke has this delay of the parousia, of the second coming of Jesus. I would qualify that Luke has a further delay of the parousia, because Matthew's already delayed it by turning the one-liner from Mark about the slave owner going away, but then he comes back and he's going to catch you. Matthew makes a full-blown parable about then there will be rewards and there will be punishments. Luke takes that whole parable, and Jesus doesn't tell it as part of the apocalyptic discourse. It's before they even get into Jerusalem, and the narrator says, now Jesus told this parable because the disciples thought that the end was going to happen immediately, and he wanted to prepare them to be patient and to wait. So again, those kind of snowballing trajectories presume that it has already happened. The destruction of the temple, the Jerusalem revolt, the Jewish revolt, all of those things have happened, and the end of the world hasn't come yet. And we tend to date Mark first and a little closer to 70, because the apocalyptic discourse in Mark sure sounds like he thinks the end is nigh. Later gospel writers are saying, Could happen any moment, could be today, but I still, I always tell students that Jesus might come back on Thursday, but you should still be studying for the test on Friday. And that's what we see Matthew and Luke doing. And what do we see in John? Judgment's already now. You either believe or you don't. You're already judged. You're either saved or damned. It's already here. What's anybody waiting for? Just love one another.
When Mark is writing his gospel, how is he trying to build over Paul's theology? What's Mark's goal in relation to Paul's letters?
I think Mark's very Pauline, and I think that some strands of earlier scholarship got this wrong, particularly like Ferdinand Christian Bauer, who has this idea. He was the Griesbach hypothesis that it went Matthew, Luke, and then Mark third. That was in vogue in the day, and so when Bauer created his theory for all of the origins of early Christian literature, he assumed that Matthew came first, and there were a lot of confusing elements to that. I think that it makes the most sense to see Mark as the Pauline gospel. It is the least insistent upon Torah observance. It sounds very much like an extrapolation of the way Paul would talk about Gentiles not being under the burden of the law, those kinds of things. I think Mark presupposes. Ricky Scheinel at Vanderbilt wrote a great article on this when at the healing of Peter's mother-in-law, right? In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus heals her, and then everybody else waits until sundown to come to Jesus for healing. And the point is to avoid healing on the Sabbath, and the idea of when they begin to eat. He what Scheinel showed, Schinall. This is a JBL article from several years ago. I actually read it when he was writing it as a master's student, and I took it to AJ Levine, and I said, I've been reading for the past few years, writing my dissertation, and this term paper is the best thing I've read in the last 5 years. Who is this guy? And he's just that smart. Also happens to be a surgeon and a medical doctor. But he has this great piece about Roman misconceptions that the Sabbath day was a day of fasting. And you can see this in numerous sources. And Mark is sort of playing on these Roman stereotypes that get Judaism wrong. And it's just very Pauline that this stuff doesn't apply, and Sabbath isn't for Gentiles. And boy, does Matthew come in as a corrective to that, to say, don't break any commandments, Paul. Don't teach anyone to break any commandments, Paul. Maimonides counts up 613 commandments of Torah, but I imagine Matthew just saying, can we start with 10? Can we just start with the original 10? And Sabbath is one of them. And Paul is out there saying, you don't have to keep Sabbath if you don't want to. And I think Matthew's scratching his head and saying, really? And so there is this sort of corrective to saying, okay, a little more Torah observance, please. A little more Peter, a little less Paul. That sort of back and forth. And here's where I think Bauer has it right, that Luke is really trying to mend the fences. Luke's trying to establish a big tent to say, yay, there's room for both of us. Peter and Paul are both dead. They're martyred. If you think back to 1 Corinthians, Paul tells you, Peter, there's rivalry between people who follow Peter, people who don't follow Paul. Paul keeps insisting, like, am I not an apostle? Well, Peter would say, no, you are not. Please sit down. Please shut up, and please stop sending so many letters. Just listen to the apostles, right? And Paul saying, but I am an apostle. And so you have that back and forth. Well, when they're both martyred, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to argue about which one of them you follow. And so we have Luke trying to say, well, Peter was a lot more like Paul, and Paul was a lot more like Peter, if you knew the full story. And so let me write the book of Acts for you and do that. So I think we start with Mark as the Pauline gospel. And then I think Matthew is sort of the Peter's corrective. We need more Judaism than that. Not all these commandments were given to Gentiles. Everybody agrees on that, but let's not be so dismissive of the commandments. And Luke says, okay, let me try to settle this so that there's a big tent. And if you're one of this tiny minority of people in the ancient Roman world who even believe that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, well, then maybe we should all just get along.
What do you think Luke's goal is with the book of Acts?
I think as I was just saying, that sort of let me explain how we can all just get along. If you read Paul's letters, Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles. Peter is the apostle to the Jews, and then Peter stands up in the book of Acts and says, "Well, everybody knows that God picked me to be the one to first bring the good news to the Gentiles." And we have this Cornelius story, right? And then we have Paul going into synagogues and preaching in synagogues, not going into Gentile territory, saying, I don't want to go anywhere where any other apostle has ever gone. I think that Luke really is trying to smooth that out. And that's the one thing. This is just what F.C. Bauer said in the first half of the 19th century, and I think it was spot on. He says, particularly when he's talking about Acts, he says, "You'll never find a more self-conscious author who knew exactly what his intentions were than what we see with the book of Acts. That it really is about trying to smooth out this debate between Peter and Paul. How much of Torah is going to apply in the church?" You see Luke trying to relax things and saying, kosher laws, they definitely don't apply. Sabbath is kind of an open question. Use your judgment, which is what Paul says in Romans, right? Some people think one day is special. Other people think every day is special. So the authentic Pauline letters very much leave room to keep Torah, voluntary Torah observance. They're just opposed to compulsory Torah observance. The wrinkle in all of this is, I think, when we get to the Deutero-Pauline letters like Ephesians and Colossians, it really doesn't sound to me anyway like voluntary Torah observance is still on the table. It sounds like, why are you keeping these days and these months and seasons? You used to be pagan and now you're not. Like, why trade pagan festivals for Jewish festivals? That doesn't make any sense. And why can't we all just be one? And Torah becomes this dividing wall that set up animosity between Jews and Gentiles, and Christ came to abolish Torah. That's the exact opposite of what Matthew says in the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus says, "Do not think I came to abolish Torah." So that's where I think we get more of a wrinkle. And I actually think John really drifts in that camp and needs to be put in more of the Deutero-Pauline conversation of Ephesians, Colossians, Hebrews, things like that, where I don't know how much John really thinks Torah still applies. We have this love one another is the one and only commandment, and that's very different from Paul saying, if you love God and you love your neighbor, you will keep all of the commandments. You will have fulfilled all of law. Well, any rabbi in the first century could have said that. Like, yeah, that's what Torah does. It tells you how to please God and how to get along with your neighbors. So, and that's why we don't work on Sabbath, and it's why we don't commit adultery. And the farther we go in church history, we just get this big demographic shift in the second century where there aren't a lot of Jewish Christians anymore. And so all of the Gentile Christians are like, yeah, those laws don't apply anymore. And there's no great debate that settles these hugely significant questions. It's just a demographic shift.
Hi, Fish and Ty, thank you for your super chat. Is the Olivet Discourse referring to the Pella flight?
It could be. I mean, I think it's just in general, get out of Jerusalem because it's burning. So, I hope I really fear for the women who are almost about to go in labor in those days. Boy, is that going to be a hard trip. I think that that it's absolutely referring to the Jewish revolt and the attack that Jerusalem is under siege and that people have to run for the hills because Jerusalem is burning. But I don't. What we can also try, I think, sometimes to get too specific of what we think happened next, and some sort of rendezvous point in the beginnings of earliest Christianity, where I say, I think it's just more generally saying it's going to hit the fan, and you need to get out of Dodge.
Hold on one second. Just trying to mute my phone there.
No problem. I probably should have done the same, but nobody calls me. So,
so what do you think about the we passages in Acts? It's argued. Some argue that that goes back to a hypothetical we document.
Yeah, I don't do as much with Acts, and I don't think that that we should put too much weight on this as first person authority. Could Luke have been an eyewitness to all of this? Sure. I can't prove it one way or another, so I tend not to make strong arguments about things I can't prove. But can I prove conclusively that Luke was there and that this was a first-hand account? No. Yeah, it could be a literary device. It could be authentic, and I am just agnostic on those kinds of questions. I don't want to base an argument on something that's at best 50-50.
And now I would now like to shift to in John 21. It talks about that the author has seen a document that was written supposedly by the beloved disciple.
Well,
do you think that
you have the idea that all the books in all the world couldn't contain all the wonderful things that Jesus did, and others have speculated that is John tipping his hand to saying, I've read other Jesus books, and the most likely candidates would be the Synoptics. I wouldn't disagree with that. Where some scholars then go is to say, and what John is saying is, mine's better than all the rest. You only need mine. And that's where I hope that my book and other things that I've written will intervene and say, that's not how reading and writing work in the Greco-Roman world. We see ample examples of book collection and close study of highly similar literary works. There becomes a market for a book. A great analogy is the Jewish War that we've talked a lot about. Josephus writes his, and in his preface, he says, there have been plural first-hand accounts, eyewitness accounts of this war written, and there have been plural second-hand accounts, people who weren't there, and there's this ongoing debate in antiquity. If you're there and you write the history, are you biased because you were there? Or is it better to be like Tacitus and say, I wasn't there. I have judged, sifted through all of the accounts, and I've adjudicated. And so now I'm writing this. That's kind of the move that Luke is making, right? I've talked to eyewitnesses, but I wasn't one. But I know everything that happened, so you can trust me when I say this. John is making this claim of, well, I was there. We have plenty of evidence of that, but Josephus knows that his readers of his account of the Jewish war will have read other books, and he's talking at some points directly about other people's books that he doesn't like. A book comes out after his, and so he writes about it later to say, you were wrong. If you knew all this, why didn't you write it sooner? And so forth. So, and he says, I was there, and you can say that I'm biased because I'm Jewish, but no one has given you the Jewish perspective, and no one knows the backstory and the build up to the war better than I do. So I'm well positioned to write this history for you. And he's writing, what, 20, 25 years after the war was over. And we're talking about his being at least the fifth book, if there were plural eyewitness accounts and plural, fifth, 10th. We have no way of knowing. That's how I view John 21. There are Jesus books out there. There's a market for them. Mine is a great one. It does make that claim to being an eyewitness. And if we're just talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's the only one that makes a claim to being written by an eyewitness. So it gives you something different than the others. But I think John presupposes that there are Jesus books. There's a market and an interest in Jesus books. There's a proliferation of them, and he's adding to that pile. But I don't for a second think that John expects people to get rid of all the others and in some way displace and replace the others. That's, again, just not how reading and writing works. I have my background blurred, but if you look at my John commentaries over my left shoulder, right, I've got 10 or 12 that are multi-volume. I've got multiple ones of each and consult them all, right? I don't just need one, even if I do have my favorites. So it's no different in antiquity. We see this in Oxyrhynchus, where we see these literary circles of people who are collecting a specific genre. They might like lyric poetry, and so we see them writing letters. Hey, if you go see so-and-so, he has a really good copy of this. Can you make a copy and bring it back? And William Johnson's work on reading in the among the Roman elite, George Houston's book, Inside Roman Libraries, those books were just transformative in my understanding of that phenomenon and the way I began to reconceive how these gospels would have been written. Because we start with this simple question of, why do we have multiple gospels anyway, right? That Matthew, Mark, and Luke are so similar to one another. That's the outlier. The closest analogy to that is to have Samuel, Kings, and then have Chronicles in the Tanakh, right? To have so many of the stories told the same way. And then what does Josephus do? He draws on Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. Sometimes in the same story, we'll combine elements from both. And sometimes he shows that he knows them in Hebrew and in Greek. So all of these sources that he's juggling simultaneously, another point that I make repeatedly, this was not too hard for ancient authors to do. So let's please stop saying that it was. You can collect and compare and take as long as you need to write another book and hopefully have something new to say. And that's what John does.
And then my final question. When do you kind of gave the answer earlier already, sometime between 70 to 110 for the composition of the four Gospels. When do you suspect they were written? Do you think they were written in close succession, or do you just keep it at the 70 to 110 range?
I just keep the broad range because the lives of Cato the Younger, and I first got onto this Richard Bauckham in his work on biographies. I am not interested in the genre of the Gospels, but as he was talking about biographies as a genre, he's written on it, but I just happened to be at a paper he was presenting, and he talked about the lives of Cato, and I just made a note about it, and I thought, I need to know about this. And I started looking up, by my count, at least 9 lives of Cato the Younger. And when he died, Julius Caesar did not like him and wrote against him. So you get pro-Cato and anti-Cato lives of Cato written in rapid succession. But the one that we have comes from Plutarch, and it's more than 100 years later. But Plutarch will name his sources, and he'll say, oh, these are still well loved, and they were still in circulation. So that gave me a great example of rapid proliferation, but also a long gap. Josephus, with what he says about other histories of the Judean revolt, I think that gives you another great example of relatively rapid proliferation. And so I just say it could be either. And I want to leave it at that, because I think that you can go through any number of textbooks, and very well known and good, well selling textbooks and introductions to the New Testament that will say Mark was probably written about 70, Matthew was probably written about 80, then Luke in 90, and John in 100. And every time I read that, I kind of figuratively throw my hands in the air, because I think, how on earth could you know that? Why would we make that claim? Why these neat 10-year increments? There's no reason it couldn't have been all four written between 70 and 72. There's no reason it couldn't have been one written in 70, three written in between 109 and 110. I don't think that that we can know those things, so I don't think we should speculate. It's like Wittgenstein ending the Tractatus, right? Whereof we cannot speak, thereof. I'm going to butcher the quotation, but we just shouldn't say more than we know. Whereof we cannot speak, thereof we must remain silent, is, I think, the English translation of Wittgenstein's point. And I think that's a good rule for scholars, not to claim more than we know, especially precision with dates. Now, with Ignatius, I will say he's part of this camp that you already start to see with Clement in the 90s, where Clement will say things when he writes to the church at Corinth. Well, now Paul wrote to you and he was an apostle. I am a mere bishop, but all the apostles are dead, so you better do what I say, because I'm bishop and I'm all you've got. And Ignatius is very much in that camp. Do what your bishop says. I know your bishop, this is his name, and so you better do as he says. And so that they seem to think of the Gospels as apostolic, to me, means the ink is not still wet on the papyrus, right, when Ignatius is reading the Gospels. But again, what's to say he couldn't read a new gospel that was less than a year old and say, I really like this one? Because we see a similar thing, right, when we first hear about the Gospel of Peter. Serapion reads, is like, oh, that was interesting. I didn't know there was a Gospel of Peter. Then he thinks about it some more and he writes back, he's like, yeah, now I actually have some reservations about it. And so you could encounter a gospel that's new to you, and you would have no way of knowing how recently it had been written. Could have been sitting around for 50 years for all we know, right? Or it could have been hot off the press. So I just don't think that we can say or know. And I just want to say, I think Ignatius is a good end point. For those who want to say, Ignatius is probably later than 110, maybe he's 130. Well, now we start to get into Justin Martyr, Tatian, Irenaeus territory, where we know that they have our four. And there's no serious debate about that. Justin Martyr has Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Tatian has Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Ignatius has Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. So pushing anything to mid-2nd century makes no sense to me. But for me to say the descriptions of the Jewish war have enough detail in them to say this had actually happened, even if Jesus had made the prediction 40 years earlier. But then Ignatius, to me, gives me a pretty good stopping point to say, from that point on, we're starting to see exegesis of the Gospels and a pretty solid and quick momentum for these four, at least for Tatian. Tatian's an interesting example I could talk all day about. But in essence, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, those are the ones that he harmonized, so they have some authority. The wrinkle is he wrote a fifth gospel, right? He wrote a new gospel and nobody told him not to, so he puts them together. So they're authoritative, but they're only so authoritative because he writes his own. But again, once we get to mid-2nd century, those late dates to me are not compelling at all, because again, we see that book collection and the close study of them, and we start to see exegesis of them being worked out and invoked as the apologists are writing in the 2nd century. So I like to leave it open and say it could have been either. I think the rapid succession is an interesting thought experiment. I just won't stake a claim on it. I think long increments, that's also possible. I think they are equally plausible, so much so that I will not try to pinpoint a date.
I have Christian Ty. Thank you for your super chat. Who is the beloved disciple?
I have no idea, and I've been agnostic about this question, but I'm going to wait and let Mark Goodacre answer that question, at least as it pertains to the character in the Gospel of John. As a historical figure, it's anybody's guess, but I've had the pleasure of reading Mark's book, which isn't out yet, and so I won't spoil the argument that he makes. But I will say that I am no longer agnostic on that question because Mark is so convincing.
I'd like to remind everybody to go get James Barker's book. The link to it is in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment. It's for pre-order. And that being said, thank you for joining me today, James.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure talking to you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.